No Longer Mourn for Me When I Am Dead is a famous poem by Alfred Lord Tennyson. It talks about the ideas of immortality and transcendence through time and space. It speaks of the idea that even though death occurs, life goes on. The poem speaks of how we should not grieve for those who have passed, but instead, we should celebrate their lives. The poem draws on the idea that life is something that we should cherish and not take for granted. It conveys the idea that life is something to be treasured and appreciated. The poem speaks of how death should not be a cause for grief or despair, but instead, life should be celebrated and embraced. Tennyson's poem speaks to the idea of finding peace and comfort in the memories of life and the things that made living meaningful. The poem speaks of how life should not be seen as something finite, but rather, life should be appreciated and enjoyed to its fullest. Tennyson also alludes to the idea that life should be enjoyed in the moment and that we should not fear death. Tennyson's poem speaks of the idea that life should be celebrated and that death should not be feared or looked upon with grief. The poem speaks of how life should be cherished, not taken for granted, and not wasted away in sadness. Tennyson's poem speaks of how we should enjoy life and not live in a state of despair. Tennyson's poem is powerful in its message that death should not be a source of sadness, but instead, it should be seen as a part of life. The poem also encourages us to appreciate life and not be consumed by grief and sorrow. Tennyson's poem speaks of the power of embracing life and not wasting it away in mourning and sorrow. The poem speaks of how death is part of life and that we should not fear it. Tennyson's poem speaks of the power of living life to its fullest and how death should not be feared. The poem speaks of how we should not mourn for those who have passed but instead, we should celebrate their lives and the memories they have left behind. The poem encourages us to appreciate life and not take it for granted. The poem speaks of the idea that life should be enjoyed and not wasted away in despair and sorrow. Tennyson's poem speaks of how we should not be consumed by mourning, but instead, we should celebrate life and look forward to the future. The poem encourages us to take risks and make the most of our time on this earth. Tennyson's poem speaks of how we should not dwell on the past and the things that we cannot control. The poem encourages us to live life without regret and to appreciate the sources of joy and fulfillment in life.